Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for day 3 of the San Diego Rep Latinx New Play Festival. We are so excited to bring to you our scholars panel. These are scholars from across the U.S. who are experts in Latinx theater and Latinx arts history. So I'm going to hand it over to Jade Power Sotomayor, our incredible panel moderator.
It's my great joy and pleasure to be able to moderate this panel with these 4 scholars that are really great repositories of wisdom, perspective, politics, artistry, cultural critics, and this panel, as part of this festival, um, is an opportunity to be able to kind of um, philosophize and think more deeply about what it is, the context of what it is that this festival might mean, in which it's existing, right? Where does this festival fall into place, and given the long history of Latinx theater making, performance making in the U.S. So without further ado, I would like to bring in our panelists. And as they all come in lieu of reading their bios, their extensive accomplishments, I'll have everyone go around and just give a brief introduction of themselves, where they work. These are all folks with doctorates, right? That doctorate in philosophy. They're philosophers, they're makers, they're artists, they're thinkers, and just tell us where you where you're at, and what your kind of general area of specialty might be, and then I'll get into asking you some of these questions that I circulated beforehand. Um, let's start with the newest minted doctora here, Doctora Karina Gutierrez.
Buenos días. My name is Karina Gutierrez. I'm a current assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at Santa Clara University. As Jade mentioned, I just completed my first year, but feel like I am starting anew all over again in these after times of COVID. A lot of my research lies at the intersection of politics and performance, specifically social protest theater movements. And forgive me if I seem a little dim. I'm currently in the midst of tech for a show. So in addition to completing my first year, I'm also getting ready to direct a show that opens this week. So very happy to be here with all of you, and thank you so much for having me.
Welcome. Chantal.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chantal Rodriguez. I'm calling in from New Haven, Connecticut, which is land of the Quinnipiac, Wappinger, and Paugussett peoples. I'm the Associate Dean of the David Geffen School of Drama at Yale, and I'm an assistant professor adjunct in the Department of Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism. My work has been sort of documenting contemporary Latinx theater in the US with a particular focus on the festival tradition. In my work as a producer, in my previous life before Yale with the Latino Theater Company, and some of my work now continues to document festivals. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and just thrilled to be in this panel in which my life has intersected with all of you in different times. So thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Awesome, thank you. We are honored to have you. Daphne, making another appearance.
I'm all over the place today, this weekend actually. I'm Daphne Secret. I am an assistant professor at Loyola Marymount University. I'm calling in from Los Angeles, the land of the Gabrielino and Toponga peoples. And I specialize and I focus my dissertation and my research on Afro-Latinidad, specifically in the United States, and more so, the intersections between Latinidad and Blackness, and what does that mean, and exploring that. I also focus on theater for social change, and teach those sort of courses, as well as being a professional director, and nonstop directing. So lots of stuff, combinations of all these passions, and just continuing doing the work on a consistent basis.
Thank you. And yes, the nonstop directing speaks to the need, right, and speaks to the hunger and the magnetic pull that we have, right? So we need directors, we need new works, we need directors for the works, we need actors, we need all of it. So yes, so thank you. And Señor Jimmy, so great to see you.
Hello, everyone. So great to see all of you. Yeah, just the intersections and just what it means to be able to come together in a time like this. I'm Jimmy Noriega. I'm Associate Professor of Theater at the College of Worcester in Ohio, so I'm not calling from one of the coasts right now. I work on the intersections of Latin American theater and Latinx theater and the ways that each influences the other or perhaps maybe resists the other at times. I'm really interested in the way that community-based theater tells stories, works as acts of activism, or even works of re-envisioning a new future for communities that really have not seen themselves as having a voice or visibility in the public sphere. But I'm also a director, like we were just talking about. So I have my own theater company, Teatro Travieso, Troublemaker Theater, which is a small little group, but we do a lot of plays and get out there to try to tell stories in areas that might not have access. In particular, right, not working in the big cities, but working in different types of networks to bring those stories to communities that do need them. And I'm just really pleased to be here with all of you today.
Thank you for that, and thank you for also planting the question of making theater outside of big cities. I think that's actually a really kind of important question right now, right? Especially as Chantal has pointed out in the festival tradition, right? How do festivals bring us together? But what is happening when we're not in a festival, and where is it happening? Okay, so I have. Because we can't cover all of Latinx theater history in our, remaining minutes, I have asked if you all could, as a way to organize our thinking, not since its inception, right, but or so-called inception, but in the last 10 years, right? So I've asked you to think about, if you could share with us what you think of as what you see as key moments, questions, or concerns in Latinx theater making in the last 10 years, the last 5 years, and then the last year. And I mean, that can also, obviously, in the last year, we're going to include questions raised by the pandemic, quarantine, etc. And then as part of that, what do you think will be the most pertinent questions or actions 5 years from now, as we're thinking about this sort of 21st century trajectory? So whoever wants to answer the first part of that, all of that, have at it.
I can start, and I think, and it might help too, because I think it sort of like wraps up almost everyone that's in the room as well. So I started my PhD work in 2007. It took me 10 years to get my PhD. And by 2008, I was attending ATHA. And so, yeah, so we're looking at more than 10 years, right? And I remember like meeting Jimmy and meeting other Latinx theater scholars that were just really incredible at mentoring and hearing the conversations of what was going on with Latinx theater. I remember serving in a panel with Brian Herrera, and we were talking about representations in theater. And it was just really, really exciting, just being a brand new PhD, serving on these panels and just listening to what was happening. So, over 10 plus years ago, we were having these discussions of representation. And it was just by coincidence. It was Brian, it was Juan and myself, and we were talking about the Cape Man, we were talking about In the Heights, right? Because that's what we had musical-wise to talk about in the mainstream of musicals, right? And then I it's something I'm never gonna forget. Oh, and we're talking, of course, West Side Story. We all have issues with West Side Story, so we were talking about these things. And so I don't include West Side Story usually because it's written by white men that are not Latinx. And so that was the conversation happening, right? 10 plus years ago in a room of us questioning representation. And I think you fast forward to this year, and we're still questioning representation, and but we've expanded on that question. We've really expanded on sort of like questioning what is Latinidad, and is this something that we want to continue forth? We are really questioning language. We've moved from literally 10 plus years ago of being like Latino, Latina, to the arroba, to Latinx, to Latine, Latin, and so we're really moving the progression even of the language in itself of what all of this looks like. And so I think there's lots to question and look like and expand. And it excites me to have been in this field long enough to have seen this progression of like where we were starting, where I was starting, we're having these intersections and these conversations to seeing where they're at now. And so when you look at the big picture, I'm seeing the progress. When you look at the small picture, it doesn't look like there's been any progress. And people will be like, oh, we're still having the same conversations, but they're different. And they're more detailed and they're more specific. And I think that that's really important to sort of remember as we continue. I just finished having a class on Latinx theater this week with my students. And the question for them was, what do we want to use language-wise? And almost all the students have decided upon Latine, Latin instead of Latinx, which I thought was fascinating. And I was like, well, that's the language we're going to use in the class. Of course, my course title is Latinx Spirit and Drama. And so now I'm like, I'm going to probably have to change the title of the course. But I think that's really, really important. And next week, they're going to be reading, Chantal, the chapter that you had on like, what's next for Latinx. And they're going to be reading, it's 20 something pages and they're going to be reading it. And I'm really excited because we did this last year. They read this during the pandemic. And what we discovered last year in reading that section, that chapter, and that collection of interviews that you gathered from people all over the field, which is amazing, was that because of the pandemic, we had to fast forward. And so all of a sudden, a lot of the things that were being said in those essays that were like, what's going to happen in the next 20 years are literally happening right now. So that vision, like when you published this in 2019, post, pre-pandemic, everyone was like, well, this is where we're going to go. This is what we're going to do. Then we have a pandemic and all of a sudden those 20 years were fast forwarded like this. And I think that to me is fascinating, that we had a vision in the field, artists and directors and scholars that thought would take 20 years and the pandemic sped it up to 1 year. And I just think that to me is like mind-blowing. So I just want to sort of throw that out there, sort of full circle of these conversations and where, Latinx theater, Latin theater is headed and going.
Yeah, Jade, sorry. If I could jump in also, yeah, to go off of that, I think, right, when I talk to my students about what's been happening these past 20 years, I always go back to kind of that moment at the turn of that new decade where we had Latinas winning Pulitzer Prizes and Broadway shows opening up, penned by people like us, right, from Water by the Spoonful, in the Heights, Hamilton now. We had Zoot Suit open in Mexico City, right, to this overwhelming success. And we have obviously someone who's very popular, John Leguizamo, who again has appeared again and again on Broadway and whose piece is now, Latin History for Morons, is now on Netflix, reaching a wider audience. So I think about what those moments meant to kind of be propelling us into the future in terms of visibility, right? But then almost fast forwarding now and seeing where we are, I kind of question, right, how much of that momentum do we still have? In what ways has that momentum transferred into different forms? But I was really thinking about your question, right? 10 years, 5 years, past year. And I was really trying to think, what have I seen differently in the past 5 years? And I think from the theater that I've seen, maybe it's the theater I gravitate to, I've seen a lot more queer representation, a lot more trans representation, in a lot of solo performance. Which again, we have to talk about why solo performance allows this to happen and why solo performance becomes the medium for queer artists to want to tell their stories, to want to put themselves out there, right? It's a very brave act. It's a very risky act, but it's an act that's often sought out by queer Latinx people. And I think it's just really fascinating, right? To see what's done maybe in less mainstream venues, what's done in more mainstream venues in terms of queer visibility in Latinx theater. And then I was trying to look for one instance in this past year during the pandemic where I really saw something that was, I thought, a little bit groundbreaking, exciting, maybe a hint for the future, was Romero Fest. So the festival online hosted by Arizona Theater Company that was dedicated to Elaine Romero. And it was a whole month of her theater happening online, with companies, groups, schools from the US and Mexico that kind of generated this whole excitement about one playwright's career and trajectory, but really kind of opened up our eyes, I think, to how this festival network, to how access and kind of celebrating the work of one artist can happen in a different medium than we have thought of before. I loved it. And I hope that it's something that we don't lose and that we're able to find more moments like that, because I think that it was exciting, right, to bring together so many theaters, many of them not even dedicated to works by Latinx artists, that were saying we're committing to one of her plays, to one of her films, to one of her short shows, and we want to be a part of the celebration of what her legacy has been.
You know, I think one of the more interesting conversations that are happening right now is really the questioning of the theater apparatus as a whole. Daphne, you spoke about having very few kind of examples in Latinx representation on, you know, the Broadway stages versus the regional stages. And I think that when I was a student, you know, 5 years ago, even, the question was for what purpose, for what audience? And that usually meant that when it comes to Latinx theater, there's an over-articulation of identity. There is, to a degree, a selling of certain traumas that made us very uncomfortable. And I think now we're unapologetically, be it the pandemic or other conversations that are happening as part of the living document, and we see white American theater, we're establishing that we don't need to cater to those audiences, that we can have our own complex conversations in-house and within our complex non-monolith communities, and that's exciting. And I think that the pandemic has really exacerbated that in such a positive way, because it's allowing us to really consider and really hold other regional theaters' feet to the fire to consider issues that they were all too comfortable sweeping under the rug. That's exciting in many ways.
Yeah, and I'll also share I'm also thinking about like leadership, representation and leadership, right? So when I think about what's changed from the last 10 years, right? I think about leaders like Jacob Padron, Stephanie Ibarra, Maria Goyanes, like folks in major institutions leading those institutions, right? Luis Alfaro was just named as an associate artistic director, and he has a long historic relationship with Center Theater Group. And so thinking of, and all of you in this group as well, sort of the leadership roles that we see Latinx folks taking, and how those institutions could be shifting. You know, they're all sort of this giant ship that need to shift. Like big institutions take longer to make rapid change. But that's something I think about, especially in the last 5 years. But I also love what Jimmy said about this. I hope we don't lose it as well, this desire to like honor ancestors and to honor our playwrights and our artists, right? So I think about somebody like Caridad Fitch, who has an amazing career, and I think about sort of how do we really continue to promote her work and acknowledge, like, you know, the work she's done with theater and climate change, and that Latinx artists are not only talking about Latinx issues, right? Latinx, for me, my biggest like soapbox is like Latinx theater is US theater, right? Because we're not talking about Latin American in this context. And so I think about the theater more broadly speaking, and always wanting to sort of raise that tension. But certainly I think those issues in the next 5 years are going to continue a legacy that has been there. But I think about like the Fornés Institute as sort of a tradition that I think the Romero Fest, I hope, you know, that I see it in the same line, that's a beautiful way for us to honor the work. And I'm currently dramaturging a piece that Diane Rodriguez had been commissioned with at Yale Rep, and so we're moving forward with that with her team. You know, so there are so many folks whose legacy we want to continue as we look to the future as well. And I think that's a thread that has been since the core and the beginnings of U.S. Latinx theater too.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for that, Chantal. Also for kind of, you know, tracking that throughout, you know, more than just the last 20 years and into a future. And I would say, you know, with the Fornés Institute also, because this is posthumous, right? Or even Diane Rodriguez, right? But while folks are living too, right? What does it mean to honor a body of work and honor a legacy while we still have these people and these elders with us? So I think that there's some of that really important bridge work happening. I think Daphne, you were unmuted. Were you going to add something there? No. Yeah, I would just add, and I think it was already kind of brought up or kind of implicit. I would add that I would say in the last 5 years, kind of to Jimmy's point about representation around queerness and solo performance, which is also a kind of a throwback to the 90s in a lot of ways too. But that, the question around not just specifically Afro Latinidad, but around, Latinidad and race, period, has really become more visible. And the last 5 to last year, I would say. I mean, the conversation has kind of accelerated notably within this last period. I would suggest. I don't know what you all think.
I mean, I completely agree. I always tell people the work was there, the work was always there, and the work has been done. And you have many artists that have been doing this work for many, many, many,
Long
many
time,
years.
decades.
Yeah. But I think because of Black Lives Matter and the protest, it was really put into question, especially within our field. Especially because there were signs that were saying like, Latinos, Latinx for Black Lives Matter, right? So you take a sign like that, and it's like that sign erases Afro Latinos from the identity of Afro Latinidad and what it means to be Afro Latinx. And people were like, "What are you talking about? No, we're saying that we're for." And I was like, "No, because by saying that you're for, you're not being inclusive of the folks that already exist within this context." And so I think that a lot of questions have been raised. Also, I love that people take to Twitter now, and within the Heights, that was fantastic to hear so many people really be and talk about Afro Latinidad in a way that has not been placed in a public light. But you have these Afro Latinx actors have been talking about this for years, but it hasn't been placed in that sort of like light. And so it's exciting to see their work being selected for theaters and starting to be produced in a way that it wasn't before. I've spoken to many Afro Latinx playwrights, and consistently what they were being told by Latinx theaters as well as white mainstream theaters is there was no place for their work. There was no audience or no place for their work. And so the work was really good, or this is my other favorite, I'm being sarcastic. We don't know how to find the actors for this work. Right. And so now all of a sudden those excuses have been sort of like pushed aside. People are not using those excuses anymore. And the work is really coming to the forefront and being produced. And we're seeing incredible plays. And again, expanding this definition of Latinidad. And I'm even seeing people depart from a definition of Latinidad. I'm seeing a lot of Afro Latinx artists actually have reached a point, because they've been advocating for this for so long, because they've been writing for this for so long, that now they're like, oh, now you want to take us in? So maybe how about we don't even accept Latinidad? I was like, maybe Latinidad's not even part of our social construct. Maybe Latinidad is something that was created to get to a proximity of whiteness. And so again, this pushing of the envelope, and I can't wait to see all of this being explored in plays. That's what I want. I want to see this being explored in plays, whether it be solo performances, whether it be, not just solo performances. So,
absolutely. And I think that it also speaks to what Karina was saying about, there's an opportunity for real internal conversations with each other and to each other, because for so long it's been like, and we saw this with the conversation around In the Heights, right? Like, don't be tearing our people down. We can't show that to the outside world. And I think there's been a kind of a tipping point of saying, no, we actually do need to have these conversations. I don't care who's listening, right? There's something about that, being able to have the kind of confidence, right? And the and like say, like, well, maybe we lose this thing that we've built, but we'll build something else. So I think that's remarkable. It's remarkable. And I think that to me, I see that really happening. And as you say, like, it's been happening, right? I've been tracking this for a long time, but it's been really turned into a public conversation in like the last 3, 4, 5 years. Okay, my next question. Oh, yes, Neil. Uh, so, Latinx theater historiography often narrates the beginnings of what we know today as Latinx theater as coming out of the civil rights era and centering a community-oriented social justice artistic praxis, something that you all have mentioned in one way or another. How do you see this legacy continuing in work that is being developed and produced today, right? So in all kinds of projects, even as movements such as We See You White American Theater have made demands for inclusion in mainstream theater institutions, right? So how does this kind of, what is this tension between like the civil rights era agitation and a kind of demand for an inclusion in institutions that are actually, you know, built around around economic concepts of what we could call neoliberal inclusion, right? So, you know, who wants to? What do you think?
Well, I can talk to some of the conversations that we're having in the Bay Area right now. I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it took away many of the distractions, spotlighting the true inequalities of our industry. And in and of itself, that's not enough. I think there was a definite pull after We See You White American Theater and the Living Document come out to say, okay, well, we'll produce something, we'll produce anything. And we're like, okay, but the greatest hits, the historical greatest hits are not enough. From the production side, one of the changes that is most exciting to me is that theaters have begun to implement anti-bias and bystander training requirements for all contracted artists and staff, as well as kind of clear processes of addressing inequities. They've also started to kind of put together like a distributed leadership, which makes it inclusive for folks who identify as Latinx, Latine to choose a season. But I think they've started to, again, examine for what process, which audience are we neglecting, which audiences are we bringing in, and we cannot rely on the greatest hits anymore. We have to foster new artists. It is no excuse. We need new work. We need new directors. I mean, I think the amount of Latinx, Latine female directors is still very, very, very low. And so those are the conversations that are happening now. In addition to that, it's how do then we approach the art form, not just in terms of production, but what do we do as institutions? And so in the same way that we are beginning to have land acknowledgements before shows, we're also starting to do things like pay the Shumi land tax, which is, Shumi is a word for, it's Chochenyo Ohlone for gift, which means that we are looking to also give back as institutions as a way to kind of rematriate the land and support the community that we inhabit. So those are the conversations that happen just in a year. So it's really, really possible to move the pendulum forward. It's just, you know, institutions are slow to change, I would say.
Yeah, I would also share, like, you know, I think the We See You White American Theater demands themselves are also, many of those demands are applicable to what we might call culturally specific theaters, or like, you know, to Latinx theaters. We've already discussed in this panel ways in which Latinidad, right, is can be problematic, or the racial dynamics. And so just because a theater is culturally diverse or racially diverse doesn't mean that they have like all gender restrooms, doesn't mean that there isn't transphobia or ableism, right? So I think those are field-wide calls to action that theaters of color you know, have a different path through them, but that are still absolutely useful. The other part of your question I really love, I think the artists that I see doing this work that's in line, many artists, but two that come to mind right away, I think of Jose Torres Sama's work with like Taco Truck Theater as a direct line from El Teatro Campesino, which he himself, right, has identified. So like that legacy is very clear artistically. I think about like Vicky Grice's work with the community, right? And like, I mean, and Daphne had talked about that, What's Next for Latinx Forum, and Vicky's piece in that is really powerful. So I encourage folks to check it out. But she, you know, these are artists that like literally walk the walk of their politics and their values. And there's so many others that, you know, I'm not naming right in this moment, but the ones in this festival, right? Like all of the, I see that lineage, but with a contemporary set of like, what are the current conditions now? Like, Jose is on the ground dealing with hurricane relief as an artist, and so those are two people that immediately come to mind, or Christiana Ray Colon and the work that she's doing in particular around violence against Black bodies and how her work is confronting that issue. So those are some of the artists that I think that immediately come to mind when we're mapping that trajectory.
And I'll just throw in real briefly, I find it fascinating still, right, just the connections of what performance and visibility is when it comes to issues of immigration, and that several of the large immigration activist networks and groups have actually sought out theater artists to both teach their members how to use theatricality, how to tell narratives, how to use visual symbols, both in street manifestations, but even more importantly, I was impressed by United We Dream when their storytelling workshop was about telling their own stories to themselves. So, right, not even meant for the outside world, meant as a way of almost sharing amongst themselves what their own individual paths were, what their own ways of dealing with their lives in different states, in different parts of the country, and seeing how the theater itself doesn't always have to be something staged for an outside public. It could be used to both nurture, heal, and inspire other members of the Latinx community. And again, right, with United We Dream, it's not only Latinx youth, it's youth of all immigrant backgrounds. So it's also being used as a bridge, as a gathering place for those narratives and stories.
That is so beautiful. Thank you, Jimmy. Did you have something to add to that, Daphne? Or no? I was thinking too in this conversation about, because I just saw a headline this morning about, California, from a California perspective, and ethnic studies is being approved for a state curriculum, and that now there's, to use Jorge Huerta's un barullo, about the Aztec poem, what they said in the newspaper, the Aztec poem, right? So Ilakech, about the inclusion of this in this curriculum, and it made me think about, well, what will be the role of Latinx theater and Latinx storytelling, kind of the way that you just articulated it so beautifully, Jimmy, about telling our stories to ourselves in some ways. What will be the role of this theater history and these artistic voices in this curriculum, right? In a kind of California statewide ethnic studies curriculum, K through, university. So that's something I think we could all look forward to.
I'm looking at the fusion because right now California is bringing back theater accreditations and so that you can have theater teachers in the classroom. And so I'm looking at the fusion of the two, right? I'm going to be doing a workshop with CETA with educators, and they're dying for materials that can come from ethnic studies to be hitting the populations of students that they are teaching and working with, and will be teaching and working with. And so I'm really curious to see that intersection of like, what is the curriculum going to look like in theater? Is it going to be fusion ethnic studies, or is it still going to be? And they're having these conversations, these educators, which are predominantly white in California, predominantly members of CETA are predominantly white, and they're the teachers in our classrooms teaching our kids theater. And so that to me is going to be really interesting.
It's going to be interesting. And the other part of it is that, for many of us who teach and work in theater departments and in theater specific disciplines, we're often trying to include Latinx voices in a kind of white American theater model. But I think what was interesting about the ethnic studies question is how can these artistic voices be used to teach ethnic studies, right? So it's not necessarily just about learning, including these voices in theater, but rather how are these texts openings into philosophies and into worldviews. And I think that's really powerful, and remains to be seen in 5 years from now. So another question, and we're getting close to time, but I think we have a little bit more time here. Let me see. Okay, I got a warning. And you're gonna text me. Someone's gonna text me if there's questions from the audience. If audience has questions, please put them in the chat. Send them in, and they will be sent to me via all our various tech, round the world tech here that we have. But I just, you know, what do you if you can answer this question, if you we've already sort of kind of danced around it, but sometimes, you know, it's worth asking, what is useful and what is limiting about Latinx theater, Latina theater as a container, right? As a lens for understanding performance work. Um, in working from this perspective and through this rubric, can we help shape new perceptions of Latinidad and not just reflect those that already exist? Right? Can we? You think this is something that we can do? What are maybe where do we find the limitations? What is still very useful about it? I mean, we've been celebrating this festival all weekend, and you know, and the big and small ways that it makes inroads and creates community and supports artists. But if you have any comments on that, and also, or you can just tell us what you're most excited about in Latinx theater making today, and that can be your own projects too.
Well, I think if I could put in some shameless plugs, one of the things that really excites me is the challenge that we, you know, when we hold space with our community, what are some of the challenges that we're issuing ourselves, whether they be thematic or otherwise. And two of the shows that I'm going to be directing this year really kind of fall squarely on this notion of class. And I think for so long, we've been so ready to have these questions about intersectionality, but we miss this question of class. And, you know, I'm directing The Displaced by Isaac Gomez, an incredible playwright, as well as Dream House by Ileana Pipes. And they really ask the question, can we as BIPOC folk be gentrifiers? Which is not an easy question to answer. What do we move in and inadvertently ebb out when we do so? And can we be a part of the machinery of oppression? What does that look like? And how do we, when acknowledging that, choose a different course? So I think issuing those challenges and having these plays be messy like a mango, to quote Carmelita Tropicana, is exactly the direction we need to take it in.
Yeah, if I think about what's exciting, I think I can't get, right, I work primarily in the theater department, right? So the number of Latinx students who have been coming in and who are occupying our spaces where we actually can not only teach them about this history and these wonderful playwrights and plays, but also hope and pass on, or I guess pass on and hope that they transform the American theater in a way that, I guess, like Chantal says, right, makes us understand that Latinx theater is American theater, that makes us understand that they can truly re-envision, rebuild, completely destroy, do whatever they want to create their new forms of storytelling. So again, I'm in Ohio. The number of Latinx students that I have in my department who are here learning theater, to me, is just mind-blowing. How would you expect in a predominantly white institution that many Latinx students, that many BIPOC students? But if it's happening here, I can imagine that it's happening more and more across the US. And I think that that's the moment that I'm waiting for. Just one other thing that I find interesting, and if we're allowed to shamelessly plug in, my theater group, I've been very fortunate to perform in many spaces around the world. And I'll just use a couple of examples. We performed in India, in Greece, in Belgium, and in Ireland. And what people often told us was, "Oh, it's so weird. You're the U.S. artists here at this festival, but you're Mexicans, or you're not from the U.S." And right, that ability to actually reach across and explain to them what Latinidad, what being Latinx in the U.S. means, and that yes, we are representing the U.S. and yes, we're not a strange choice. We are actually a perfect choice to talk about what is happening in U.S. theater, and to understand that other parts of the world are starting to pick up on who we are, to pick up on what it means to be a Latinx population within the US, and that it's outside of Latin America that those conversations are happening, right? We expect it to be within Latin America, but that it's happening in other places, I think really speaks to the power of how the work, how the artistry, how the scholarship is reverberating across the globe.
Thank you so much for that global perspective, Jimmy. Yes.
Yeah, I guess I'll just briefly say I'm really excited about the shift in access, right? I think Karina we've all sort of mentioned this in some way, but what the pandemic allowed, and even just now that we could be gathered virtually, right? I think the access, and so my my shameless plug is for two things. One, I'm not formally involved in, but like the Soul Project later this month has a Latinx festival that's going to be hybrid, right? The thing that I am a part of is the Los Angeles Theater Center and the Latino Theater Company at the Los Angeles Theater Center, who is like my artistic home. They're doing a third installment of their Encuentro, but it's called Reencuentro, and it's a completely virtual festival that's happening in November. And so the access to see the kinds of theater that's happening, even just like I've been able to show the readings of Luis Alfaro's Greek trilogy that were available through Center Theater Group, right? I'm showing them in class, like the kinds of access that we have. I hope that we protect it and continue to find ways of sharing this access. And then, so that's something that really excites me. And then secondly, just to briefly touch on the question of like, what are the limits and challenges of Latinidad? I think what excites me about that question is that I think there is more commitment and openness to actually having that conversation, right? To actually teasing apart that, because I think there are limits, but as a unifying factor, it's useful for, but not always for every group. So what excites me is that we're actually starting to dig in more openly and publicly, because as Daphne said, right, these conversations have been since the beginning, but I think there is more openness, and I think we can keep pushing that. Especially we white Latinos pushing that conversation and the need for that conversation.
For me, there's two things. One, this past year, I worked with the Latinx Theater Alliance in Los Angeles to bring in oral histories of Latinx theater in LA from 1960 to present, where we interviewed 20 different artists and producers of theaters. And all of these are going to be documented. And it's really, really, again, really exciting to me to know that this will be available for everyone to teach in their classes, and to hear these incredible interviews by artists who've been doing this work, for decades, and how they see the work evolving. Jorge Huerta and I were curating some of the questions, and we got all these, like, we can't believe we got all these people during the pandemic, and we filmed it. And so that's a really exciting project. So that the histories of the work that has been done, going back to Chantal, what you were saying, are being recorded, and now they're going to be accessible to anyone to teach in any course. That to me is just so exciting when it comes to accessibility. And these are the stories of folks in our field that have been doing this for decades and decades. So that's really exciting to me. And then the second project that's well, not project, but like at the core of the work that I do, I can't wait to see these productions specifically by Afro-Latinx playwrights that have been workshopped in the last year in actual stages. I want to see these plays staged. I don't want them just to be part of, a reading. I don't want it just to be part of a development. I want them to be fully produced with Afro-Latinx actors being cast for these roles. And so that's sort of like my wish and hope moving forth with these plays, especially in the last year, as we're picking up that momentum. Because if you have committed to this work, you have to continue doing this work. Just because we're now sort of moving, we're still in a pandemic, but we're moving to starting to go back into the theaters. Let's see this work being actually staged. Because all of these pieces deserve to be staged. And I think that to me, that's what I want to see. Queer voices, trans voices, indigenous voices, Latinx voices. I want to see these pieces that we have curated in the past year and a half and worked on physically staged, not just in our stages, but in all stages.
Go ahead.
No, just to piggyback off of that, Daphne, I think that's one of my biggest concerns with accessibility is that I don't want this medium to become the secondary stage. And I think that's the pressure that we need to place on companies.
And historically, there's always been a kind of unique power and that comes with the margins, right? That comes with the second space, or what Fredman would call the undercommons. You can do things that you can't do in the big spaces. But Daphne, you're right. We need the resources, and we need the investment to have full productions. And I also in terms of the, recording and interviewing folks. It's such an important part of this work. And just to shout out, Dr. Jorge Huerta, for his groundbreaking legacy in doing that, right? When he would have the theater talks, right, and interview these VHS tapes of him interviewing and UCSD TV of interviewing these artists at that time, and showing us that this is part of what we need to be doing, right? So not just the work itself, but showing us how to do the work itself. We have a question here. We have 2 minutes remaining of this amazing conversation. There was a question here from Beto O'Byrne that was wondering what Karina Gutierrez might describe as the Latinx greatest hits that are being produced or advocated for. I will say anecdotally, beyond our Latina theaters, we don't see much representation in the theaters at all here in New York City, and we definitely don't see remounts of classics. So if you want to just answer that briefly.
Absolutely. I think when you look at any anthology, if there is any section on, Latino theater, what you get is Zoot Suit. You get Zoot Suit, which to me is it's great. We should absolutely teach Zoot Suit, but I think it creates this false illusion of really it's unfair in that there's no trajectory that follows. It really calcifies in the eyes of American theater the work that has happened since. So it's a disservice. So I see that as one of the greatest hits. And then of course you get In the Heights and you get some of the more mainstream shows, but in reality there's anthologies worth of work, new works that are being produced that are not getting the same stage time and or time in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And and even from a coastal context, right? So Zoot Suit might be in a West Coast context. I always ask my students when they come in, to take a class in Latinx theater, what have you read, right? What have you come across? And it's, if they've read anything, it's Zoot Suit. And Patrice and I are working on trying to get plays from the Latinx Festival, New Play Festival, published in an anthology. So more on that later down the road. And I just want to thank everyone so much for your time, for this amazing conversation that I hope gets to continue in other ways, for your thoughtfulness and wisdom and generosity, and the festival itself. And I hope you get to enjoy the plays. And if you haven't already, you can access them still. So thank you very much. Happy Sunday.